Hello, and welcome to Book Solid, New Canaan Library's podcast for adventurous readers across all genres. I'm your host, Kathleen, a collections librarian.
And I'm your host, James, a reference and instruction librarian.
And today we are discussing Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green.
So, because this is nonfiction, there's not really a spoiler that we can give you, a spoiler-free summary. So, Everything is Tuberculosis is a book about tuberculosis, which is one of the oldest and deadliest diseases basically recorded in human history. Since its scientific discovery in 1882, over 1 billion people have been killed by tuberculosis, though it has been with us since at least 4,000 years ago. In the book, John Green walks the reader through a basic understanding of what tuberculosis is, how humanity has reacted to it, how it's impacted society, and he explains how he became obsessed with the disease after meeting a young man named Henry in Sierra Leone who was suffering from a drug-resistant strain of the disease. Green alternates between covering more of the big picture aspects of the history of humanity living with tuberculosis, our changing understanding of the disease and its causes, and the obstacles that have been in place to fully eradicating it, and then going back to Henry's ongoing battle against the disease. At the end of the book, the author reveals that Henry recovers. John Green then makes a call to action for the reader to push for more resources and attention to the eradication and detection of tuberculosis across the globe.
All right, so let's get right into it. What did we think?
I really like this book, and I was a little bit surprised because I generally don't tend to like these kinds of little, how do you call them? They're like a layperson's book about a topic. Because John Green is not a doctor. He's not a medical researcher. He's none of those things.
Right.
So this is his personal kind of interested investigation into tuberculosis based on his interactions with someone who is suffering from it. But despite all that, John Green is an excellent communicator, and he really makes this very accessible. It's a complicated topic. There's medicine, and then there's disease, and there's sociology. There's a lot of stuff going on in this book, and he makes it very easy for the reader to understand what this disease is and kind of how humanity is related to it over time. It's a very well done book.
Yeah, I think I may have been a little nervous about it for a different reason, which is just because I don't tend to read books like this, maybe books that are very scientific or, something so, well, first of all, I guess such a depressing topic.
Yes.
Something that is a little daunting in that sense. But one thing that I was intrigued about was that it was written by John Green. And, having started as a teen services librarian, John Green is certainly a huge celebrity to me.
Yes, Fault in Our Stars and
exactly.
All those
so it's really interesting to see, he got his start with all these teen books and then has pivoted to adult nonfiction. So he was a fiction writer, now is doing a lot of nonfiction. He also has a huge internet presence, so he does a lot of videos for Vlogbrothers, Crash Course, these sorts of things. So whatever kind of hesitation I had about the subject matter, I think it was a little bit mitigated by the fact that it was John Green. And I agree with you, though, that it's a huge risk when you have someone whose specialty is not this topic. This is not really their area of research. And I think while that could go really badly, it goes really well here because, as you said, he's so great at distilling these ideas and presenting them in a way that's so accessible. So I think probably coming from being a YA author and then expanding that, he's able to talk to so many different types of people, which I think is really great. It's really just giving you lots of ideas in a nice package.
Absolutely. This book is it's not academic literature. You're not going to find research papers, in-depth explorations of research papers. You're not going to find in-depth explorations of medical studies. There's none of that really in here. This is very much a book written for the general audience with the basically stated goal of bringing attention to the state of tuberculosis in the modern world and understanding how it got there and what treatment and obstacles of treatment and those things, kind of what that stuff is like right now. So it's very accessible. It's very much a a book that I think anybody could pretty much pick up and read. It's not difficult. The subject matter is of course a little dark and a little upsetting. It's dealing with a very deadly disease, but overall definitely extremely accessible.
Yeah, and it's funny as you're describing it. I'm thinking, wow, who would want? This is a hugely popular book. First of all, who would pick it up based on this description of we're going to learn so much about tuberculosis? But his presentation of it, one, I think at times it's very funny and really engaging. And two, the facts that you learn are absolutely fascinating. And so I think that's like the really great thing and the really surprising thing maybe about this book is that you can take something and it can be like, why should you care about this? Why should this be something that we're talking about still, that we're concerned about? And certainly he brings in a lot of things that are very serious to it. But then there are also all these details that I think are incredible about just the ways that tuberculosis has been threaded throughout history. And it has had a hand in like the creation of the Stetson cowboy hat or a minor factor in the start of World War I. I mean, these things I did not expect.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's probably worth just kind of addressing like what is tuberculosis, right? Like what is this thing? So it's a disease, of course, primarily attacking the lungs, but it can, depending on the type of tuberculosis you get, and there are multiple types of tuberculosis, and depending on how late of a stage you're in or with tuberculosis, basically, I'm generalizing here very, very broadly here, but it can affect multiple parts of the body. It's not just the lungs. Oftentimes people think, oh, it's just the lungs. You have the vision of, the cowboy or something coughing into the handkerchief and there's blood, and you're like, oh, he's got tuberculosis, he's got the consumption, he's going to die. It's not just that. It's airborne. It's an airborne disease, so it spreads like most airborne diseases do. And it was known in ancient history. They were aware of tuberculosis. They did not call it that. Not everyone called it that. But like they found evidence of it in Egyptian mummies from like 2400 BCE. So it's been around. And back then they considered it to be one of the most lethal diseases out there. Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath guy, he actually advised his colleagues to not visit or treat people who were suffering in the late stages of the disease because he believed that they're going to die anyway and it's actually going to hurt your reputation and then they're not going to trust you for other things that you could help them with. So, again, like this is a serious disease throughout history. People knew about this one. There's different symptoms for it. I think the common term consumption derived from the ancient Greek term about the disease. It moves very slowly, which is one of the reasons why it's so insidious. A lot of the infections occur within the 2 years of the initial infection, and then sometimes it can just lay dormant for decades, only to come out when the immune system is compromised or there's other factors. There's a cure. It's not a death sentence these days. There's a 4 to 6 month antibiotic basically course that you have to take. Some patients can recover without treatment for reasons that I don't think we fully understand right now. And other people will survive for decades, but suffering from the disease. It's bad, but it is curable.
And I think this book has done a great job of humbling me into realizing basically, this is something that I thought I knew something about. As you mentioned, in pop culture, in literature, we have seen tuberculosis in maybe the shorthand for it. But there's so much more to it and the scope of it. I mean, the numbers, I can't even fathom like some of the statistics that John Green is giving in this book, because he's saying things like in all of human history about 1 in 7 people who have ever lived have died of tuberculosis. Like that is unfathomable to me.
Yeah, I think that was one of the estimates he cited. I mean, if you're looking for a little more like concrete numbers than that too, like the presence of tuberculosis in Canada in like the 30s and 40s, there is certainly here, one of the things that Green is very interested in looking at too is the disproportionate effects of tuberculosis as time has kind of gone on and the availability of the cure and treatment and sanitation has kind of helped to ameliorate the disease. But in the forced education programs that the Indigenous people in Canada had to go through, there was an 8% mortality rate of all students who were forced into residential schools because of tuberculosis. The stats are crazy. In the 20th century, like American sanatorium system was basically brought about to combat tuberculosis spread. In 1904, we had 115 sanatoriums, capacity of 8,000 people. By 1953, 839 with the capacity for 136,000 people.
Yeah, this is so hard to believe because I think, as you mentioned, it has been curable. It's been curable since the mid-1950s. So this is not something that we would see. I mean, this is a world where obviously Green is pointing out as we get into Henry's story in Sierra Leone how much it still affects many places in the world. But this is something that I just did not know about the scope of it at all. Yep. And I think he does a really great job of introducing all of these numbers in a way that is not overwhelming, that does not feel, I mean, it doesn't take away from, I think, more of also like a narrative aspect to it and storytelling. So I think he really weaves these things in a way where it will emphasize details without just feeling like it's throwing a lot of information at you out of a context.
This is not the kind of book where you get to a page and it's just bullet point lists of statistics. It's not that kind of book. There's a big narrative element to it. Green is very interested in telling stories with data, and then also when maybe there's a little bit too much data or a little bit too much history, he will very often pivot to tell the very personal story of Henry in Sierra Leone who's trying to recover from drug-resistant tuberculosis.
So, yeah, I mean, I think let's just maybe talk about some of these ways that he is structuring this book and presenting this information.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is really the strength of the book for me is, well, certainly, I think I respond most strongly to a narrative, being primarily a fiction reader, and to a personal story. So I think, and he sets up that he himself wasn't super aware of tuberculosis beyond kind of what we were talking about, just the basic ideas of it. And then on a visit to Sierra Leone for an entirely different reason, he just happens to be at this hospital where he meets a young boy who he thinks is about 9 years old, and then later learns he's 17 years old, named Henry, which is the same name as his son. So I think he feels, he's such a personable kid, and he's someone that Green really gravitates towards, and then he wants to know more about how someone who seems so full of life, who seems, it's so hard for him to imagine, especially when he thinks of his own son, like someone like Henry living in Sierra Leone with this disease that has a cure.
Yeah, and the drug-resistant TB does not necessarily mean that it's not curable by the modern antibiotic treatments to tuberculosis. There are different types of treatment, and there's a lot of different reasons why Henry has a specific type of resistant tuberculosis strain, but there were potentially other treatment options available. They were just outside of the means of the country of Sierra Leone, certainly much less Henry's ability and his family to treat it. So they were just too expensive. They weren't available. So there were a lot of obstacles to getting a treatment that would potentially have helped him early on in the book.
Yeah, and I think he's able to tell that story of why that would happen on a personal level to Henry, but also just why this happens in general with people who have a lack of access or reasons that they cannot commit to that course of treatment. Obviously money is a big issue. And, he certainly shows who is disproportionately affected by tuberculosis to this day. So, I think he knows how to frame things. He knows how to give context. And I think he creates such a compelling argument that I felt like I was able to make these arguments like afterwards, like reading this book. I was like, I can not understand everything certainly, but I can trace this path somewhat and just figure out, well, why is this still happening? What's still going on? So,
with this framing kind of the bigger picture, and then going down to the very personal narrative, it's very humanizing, right? I mean, the problem with statistics is you can see the most horrific statistics, and eventually they get so big that they stop meaning things. They just become numbers instead of people. This is very, very much grounding. Like this specific person has this specific disease. And then that is the lens with which the reader is introduced to the world that has been shaped by, and Green's portrayal of it, tuberculosis, throughout history.
And I think that's one of the great things is, so we have this personal story, but then we have a book called Everything is Tuberculosis. So it also has this kind of pull back the camera effect and show how does tuberculosis, how does it exist maybe as a symbol for like society's ills, you know, or are we able to learn or extrapolate something from the way that we regard tuberculosis now? So something that, again, has a treatment, but not everyone has access to. Something that was, as you mentioned, it's gone through a lot of different names. So this is something that if you're reading, you know, like a 19th century novel, this is consumption. What happened to change it so that now it's tuberculosis? What do we think about when we frame it in those different names, the different signifiers?
It's fascinating. Definitely one of the other things that Green is very interested in is in the portrayal of tuberculosis and how human society has basically framed what it means to have tuberculosis and what it looks like. You know, because before we understood that this was a disease, you know, it's a communicable disease like that. Because so many people were dying from it, you couldn't really say that it was God cursing you or, you know, it was your immorality. Like, there are a lot of, like, ways where people, you know, in the past very commonly would be just like, oh, this is, like, explaining why this is happening. So there's kind of a weird angle that Western society at a certain point starts taking to tuberculosis. And it gets romanticized for a period.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting because it's something that I think you have an inkling of, you know, you're thinking of like Keats or somebody, you're thinking of like these poets, like
tragic figures.
It's so tragic, but they've brought such beauty into the world with their poetry before dying at 25 or something. Like, it's this sort of thing, but you're not really, at least, you know, for me, like, I'm not really aware of, well, why is this? So there was this point when it was romanticized and even like beauty standards were influenced by it. So I mean, this is a disease where you're wasting away, but you can be, you know, you're
thin and pale, and you've got the flushed face, and it's like it's because you're dying,
right?
But people are like, well, it's horrific, like it's so horrible, like we can't just be in despair about this, so they romanticized it.
They have that great PR team of it's a divine compensation. Even your life is shortened physically, but you have this gift,
this
that you
ethereal, and then I mean, and this truly was. It certainly in like the 1800s in Europe and the U.S., people thought it was like a civilized disease, like it's the disease is a mark of civilization. In the land of racialized medicine, which was certainly in place in that time. Some people were calling it, as Green notes, the white man's plague. It was a very strange time where this kind of romantic view was existing about it.
And I think then the great thing is he points at that turning point, which is 1882, when you get the scientific explanation of tuberculosis. The bacteria that causes it is identified. And this is the beginning of the end of like that sort of ethereal kind of time.
It goes from being the ethereal disease of the poets and the kings and the, you know, and civilization to the filthy bug thing that infects you and makes you sick. And people are like, oh, that's bad. I don't want that.
Yeah. So then all of a sudden it's, you know, it's crowded housing and malnourishment, stress due to racism. These are all the things that are creating situations where tuberculosis is now affecting marginalized groups, and then suddenly, you know, it's tuberculosis, not consumption.
Green notes some wild changes in the perception and portrayal in the Western world of tuberculosis, especially in the racialized medicine circles, where, I mean, it went from being, you know, the civilized disease, the white man's disease, to people who are not white, they have smaller chest capacities. Green fully quotes a doctor who blamed it on the end of slavery and said that the way to reduce tuberculosis cases in black populations was to restore slavery. It published in some journal.
Right, of course, a journal,
Some journal ran it. A truly crazy thing to say. And then before I stated, like, you know, indigenous people were disproportionately affected by it because their movement was controlled sometimes. So there is a real disproportionate effect of tuberculosis, especially once there was an understanding of maybe more that it was this type of disease and how it spread, because then with the rise of sanatoriums and things along that nature. It was, you separate the people who have it, you give them food, you let them have the space and time and energy to recover from it, and then even if there wasn't a cure at that time, because the bodies were able to better proportionally fight back against the disease, some people were starting to survive. And still, even while this was happening, it was having an effect on society. Again, like you said earlier, the Stetson was invented because somebody got tuberculosis and was told, oh, the better air down here is going to help you survive. That the person who invented the hat moves down there, sees people going west, and notes that they all have crappy hats. And he says, this hat sucks. I'm going to invent a better hat. He goes back, he recovers, and the Stetson is born. I think it's New Mexico. And part of its push for statehood in the United States, one of the levers that it was pulling was it was saying, hey, like the great air here, we can put a lot of sanatoriums here, and you can send all these people here, and then they can recover from the disease. And that was one of the ways where it got a little bit more of accepted to say, oh, New Mexico can be a state. There is towns and cities in this country right now that where basically people would recover from the disease from the sanatoriums, and they would stay in the area. And then there's a whole bunch of cities and towns that are because of the movement of people away from big cities to these sanatoriums.
Yeah. I mean, he talks about it, that literally because of this migration, particularly to places like Southern California, for example, he mentions like Pasadena, it reshaped the geography of the country. Like that, I mean, is just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah. And then he's not glossing over this stuff too. He's not just saying, oh, the sanatoriums were an unalloyed good. Like that was part of like the sanitation, that would help produce the spread and whatever like that. He's like, no, like it becomes about control. And the way that people see people who have tuberculosis, again, part of that perspective shift from the ethereal kind of romanticized to you are sick with a bad disease. It becomes like you don't know how to treat yourself. The doctors know how to treat you. You have to, like, you can't move too much. You can't walk around. You can't read. You can't write. Like that was like, he portrays that whole system too very well with another individualized story of a young girl who I believe goes into the sanatoriums, and it kind of tracks her life briefly until she gets out of it, and it's like a moving story as well.
It really is, yeah. So he talks about there are these two girls who are best friends, and one of them, her sister also had tuberculosis. She ended up dying.
Oh, this was brutal.
Oh, I know.
The father writing the letters.
So the father is writing, pretending to be the daughter who has actually already died of tuberculosis, to the other daughter, because the thought at the time was that you can't upset someone who's convalescing, who is in one of these sanatoriums. They need to be, very rested and not upset in any way. And so the end of that story is that girl also dies of tuberculosis. So it's not real. I mean, there are all these ways that people are trying to control something they can't control. They're creating some sort of narrative, some sort of moral quandary, if you only behave the right way, if you only do the right thing. But I mean, I think it's really interesting to just see. So this is in the past, the stigma, but then we also see the stigma in the present with Henry. This is something that still persists, which is, all of your friends stop calling, or maybe your parents don't even visit you. And so one of the things that I think is very moving and important to Henry's story is that his mother is a huge champion. She is always visiting him. She is invested in his care. She has not abandoned him.
Yeah, this is definitely a book that's much less about tuberculosis itself and more about what the disease does to people.
Yeah, it's so much about, I think society and just on a more, I mean, this is tuberculosis, but it's also how everything is tuberculosis. So I think how we treat, illness, how we treat people who, maybe they can't contribute to society in the way that capitalism dictates, things like that. Like are we treating people differently based on things that they can't control? And how does this create, one of the things he talks about is like vicious cycles. How does this create situations that make a situation even worse and make care something even further out of reach?
And it's important to understand and to restate, the reason why, for me, why I was so surprised that there was still so much tuberculosis out there is because it is a curable disease. We've had the cure for quite some time. And in America, someone gets tuberculosis, and we do. There are tuberculosis cases in America to this day. But the idea that we wouldn't have access to that medicine if we really needed it is kind of not something that we think about here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where we expect that kind of access, and then Green contrasts that with the availability of these medicines in other countries around the world. And he says it's not just like getting the medicine to them. It's not just that maybe sometimes the medicine is too expensive. It's that the infrastructure in the countries, based on how those countries, were founded or how history has treated those countries, that affects the infrastructure, that affects transportation. There's logistics questions. How do you get these medications? There's the patients themselves become part of the equation too, because you simply must stay on this regimen of antibiotics to cure the disease. And if you don't, then that can create more strains of the drug-resistant tuberculosis. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to, especially when you might not have access to a support system that's willing to understand what you're going through. That's a societal support system. The resources to keep yourself fed and hydrated with safe food and water access. Any disruption to that is like the medication can really mess you up and make you not want to eat or drink. And if you don't have access to that food to keep yourself, energized to fight this disease, your outlook becomes so much worse. And he really is very careful to go over, things like not just the vicious cycles too, but the virtuous cycles that also exist. There is different groups that are committed to bringing aid to people who are suffering from tuberculosis, to expanding care, to ensuring that it's monitored, the spread, like catching tuberculosis early on so that it doesn't have a chance to mutate and become, a different strain that we don't have drugs for. He's covering that as well. It's not just a despairing book.
Yeah, I think that's certainly needed by the end. But
yes.
I think that is a great point that he makes. And he talks about himself, I think, as a person who is maybe prone to despair. It's very easy to get disheartened by things. It's very easy to think, there are all of these elements that are conspiring against, making the world better. And he's like, but there are so many, as long as people know that they can make a difference by putting the effort towards these things, that this leads to progress, this leads to huge triumphs. And so, for example, he talks about how the price of a 2-year course of curative treatment, for example, was at one point $15,000 and is now about $300. There are all these things that I think he wants to show you, like, there is hope. There are people who are doing good things. And, so that was certainly a part of the book that I really appreciated.
Yes.
And, but it is inspiring.
Yeah. But it also, it's, and it's also very clear about it. He says that every year about 10 million people get sick with tuberculosis, which is, it's crazy. And I think at the time of writing, the stat was 1.25 million die.
Yeah.
Like in the modern day. It's the most deadly disease. It was only recently, briefly, upstaged by COVID, and then it's back to tuberculosis again. I thought it was going to be malaria. I was actually shocked to hear that tuberculosis was the number one killer for diseases globally. I did not realize that it was still tuberculosis. I thought it's been something else.
Yeah, no, it is very hard to believe. And especially, when you become even more aware of how it could be treated and how, it's helps the world to have it treated. It's dangerous for everyone to have it circulating.
It's an airborne disease.
It's an airborne disease.
We know that those are very, very, very bad.
Yeah.
And he's not just saying that, we need to globally cure all tuberculosis. He's not just saying that. He's also saying that as part of the kind of virtuous cycles and the things that the call to action that the book makes is to increase funding for things like new treatments, because again, that drug resistance is a really big, just in general, in antibiotics, drug resistance is a huge thing that many people are very worried about, because there's a couple diseases out there that we really have a couple treatments for, and it's difficult, or we're still trying to design new treatments for them. And if you let the drug resistant strains really proliferate, then you can get into some pretty serious issues. And Green is very clear to point at that, saying, hey, like, the drug companies that are kind of sitting on or working with the existing cures also need to be thinking about next steps. And it's great for someone who, like me, perfect layman, I don't know barely anything about these diseases. This was a great way, I thought, for me to kind of get into that understanding of these are probably the next steps that we want to take, like globally, maybe towards addressing this issue before it
Yeah.
becomes out of control completely.
Absolutely. I mean, I think probably everyone who reads this book is like, we've got to do something about tuberculosis, but it's such a humanistic lens too, that it's not just about like, oh no, what happens, but it's like, well, what's happening right now? I mean, you can't put a price on human life, right? Like, we're having all of these people who are suffering needlessly. What can we do now? So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great call to action, and it's something that really is able to communicate so well what this issue is and why should I be invested in it. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's like a great book for really any audience.
I feel like this is a good book for book groups. Like this really is. It's not just like someone who's vaguely interested in diseases. I think that pretty much anybody could pick this up and learn something from it and enjoy just learning about this society-altering disease. It's fascinating. I really enjoyed this book.
Yeah. I recommended it to my mom, and I think she was like, oh, thanks. But then she started to read it, and she's like, okay, it's actually, it's really good.
So I've actually got a quote here, too, to just kind of help the listeners understand kind of how Green is kind of positioning what this book is about. He's talking here about one of the main points he's trying to make, which is, what's different now from 1804 or 1904 is that tuberculosis is curable and has been since the mid-1950s. We know how to live in a world without tuberculosis, but we choose not to live in that world, which is, again, talking about all the obstacles that are in place, societally, financially, infrastructurally. Like, there's a lot of different things in place, but, we could choose to live in a world without this thing, but because of these things, we have made the decision that, well, we're going to have to, make some exceptions. And the book is very much not on the side of making some exceptions. Green, his brother Hank, he had a type of cancer, I believe, that cost, in his estimates, 150 times more to cure that cancer than any case of drug-resistant tuberculosis in, for example, say Sierra Leone. But nobody ever said to him or his brother, it's not cost effective, we have better uses for these resources. So that's kind of one of the things that he's really pointing at in this book.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, I think he's very clear about, we're not going to be let off the hook. We have a responsibility. I mean, he says basically that the real cause of contemporary tuberculosis is us. And so if we are that cause, it is our responsibility to also be the cure.
Yeah, so.
All right. So do you have any read-alikes for us?
I do. If you pick this up and you are thinking, I would like more information about diseases or germs or things like that, that's kind of what I'm coming way interested in. So Very Small by Thomas Levinson is a book that covers a kind of a general covering of the globe-spanning history of how humanity discovered the microscopic world of germs, understanding that environment and how people and our nature might be getting in the way of that fight against disease. So a lot of parallels here, but with a little bit of a broader spectrum than just the specific disease of tuberculosis.
All right. I mean, that stuff made me very anxious, but that does sound very interesting as well.
And I have another one. It's The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. So if you read this book and you're like, I don't know how I feel about this disease stuff, but I do love John Green's writing. The Anthropocene Reviewed is short essays on a variety of different topics where he rates and reviews different things like keyboards, fast food breakfast menus, Googling strangers. This sounds like a terrible book. It really does. But his essays some of them are so incredible. If you liked his kind of intense focus and writing style, he directs that same kind of focus that he did on tuberculosis in this book to each of these small subjects in his essays. And some of them come out so well. Googling Strangers is my favorite in that book. It has one of the best endings I've ever read to an essay. I was almost moved to tears.
All right, I have to check this one out. I was a little I don't know what to expect from this book because it's so far-reaching, lots of different things all in one. But that sounds great.
Yeah. So Kathleen, do you have a book to recommend?
I do. So I wanted to recommend a book called The Viral Underclass by Stephen W. Thrasher. And I will say that, when I picked this book up and I knew it was called The Viral Underclass, I was like, this will probably be very heavy.
Sounds heavy.
And it is. But I just want to wholeheartedly recommend it. So this book is covering similar ground in discussing the societal elements that allow viruses to thrive, even in the presence, for example, of vaccines and treatment. But in this case, it does so through the lens of COVID-19 and HIV. So I thought it was really interesting to have somewhat of a similar approach, but for, especially, with COVID, like something so recent, something that we've really been able to track the response to because we were there from the beginning. But just an absolutely fascinating book. So Thrasher is a scholar and a journalist. He explores the ways specifically in which social structures exacerbate inequality. And so in the way of who is exposed to the viruses, so this would be the viral underclass. So who is exposed to viruses, who has access to treatment, and who ultimately survives them. So like Green, he makes the experiences of the viral underclass more immediate by including personal stories from his close friends and people he's met through his journalistic career. And I really responded to that in Everything's Tuberculosis, and I really found that effective here. That's a way that can really, I think, for me, statistics and things are overwhelming, but getting these personal stories and this really thoughtful assessment of what is happening, what do we need to do to change to make things better for everyone. I just thought it was a really eye-opening book, and I really enjoyed it. So, what are we reading next?
So, the thing that we're reading next is Vigil by George Saunders. You might recognize that author from Lincoln and the Bardo. This is very similar to that in some ways. This is a book, Vigil. It's a book set on the cusp of life and death. It follows Jill, a woman who has died and has become kind of like a spiritual guide whose maybe self-imposed role, it's unclear if she's gotten any actual messaging from some divine source or whatever, but she thinks her personal goal is to help people transition from life to whatever is next. Mm-hmm. Her current assignment is a man named KJ Boone, who is a titan of industry, and she believes probably has a lot of baggage based on the kind of high-profile life he lived in the oil industry. The problem that she runs into is this guy's pretty sure he lived a perfect life, and he's about to go to his just reward. A lot of complicated things happen here right after they meet. This is a very popular book at the library. I'm excited to read it for the podcast, especially because I've gotten mixed reviews on this one.
Okay, you're courting controversy.
Yes. I've heard that people love this book, and I've heard that people hate this book. So I'm interested to see what side of the line I fall on.
All right, nice. Yeah, so we're going to go out with a bang. This is our last book that we're discussing this season, and I don't know what we're going to think. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm very excited to see what happens here.
All right, so that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening.